October 13th, 2007. The California sun cast long shadows across Knott's Berry Farm as families wandered through the theme park, their laughter mixing with the distant sounds of roller coasters and carnival music. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, the kind that promised nothing more than simple pleasures and forgotten worries. Liam Wilson sat alone on a weathered wooden bench near the ghost town section, his 28-year-old frame filling out a faded blue t-shirt that had seen better days. At 265 pounds, he carried the weight of too many late-night fast food runs and stress-induced eating habits. His brown hair was slightly disheveled, and his round face bore the telltale signs of someone who had been arguing just hours before. The fight with Sarah had been brutal. 3 years together, and she still couldn't understand why he needed space when things got overwhelming. The words had been sharp, cutting deeper than either of them intended. "You always run away, Liam," she had screamed as he grabbed his keys. "You never face anything." Now, surrounded by the cheerful chaos of the theme park, Liam sipped his orange juice slowly, watching a group of children race past with cotton candy-stained fingers. The sweet artificial smell of funnel cake drifted through the air, mixing with the earthy scent of the park's famous boysenberry preserves. He had always been the type to seek solitude when his temper flared, a habit that worried his father, Robert Wilson, more than Liam ever realized. Robert had called twice that morning, but Liam had let it go to voicemail. His father's voice, always patient and understanding, had left messages about Sunday dinner with his maternal grandparents, Eleanor and Frank Martinez. They were getting older, his father had said, and they looked forward to these weekly gatherings more than anything else. Liam checked his phone. 3:47 p.m. The park would be open for several more hours, but the crowds were beginning to thin as families headed home for dinner. He stood up, tossing his empty cup into a nearby trash can, and decided to walk toward the Timber Mountain log ride. The gentle splash of water and the mechanical sounds of the attraction had always calmed him since childhood. As he walked past the Calico mine ride, Liam's phone buzzed. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. He stared at it for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the answer button. The ringing stopped, then started again immediately. This time, he turned the phone off completely and slipped it into his back pocket. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the park's Old West facades. Liam paused near a group of teenagers taking selfies by the stagecoach, their carefree laughter reminding him of simpler times. He had been coming to Knott's Berry Farm since he was a child, first with his grandparents, then with friends, and later with Sarah during their early dating days. A security guard in a brown uniform walked past, nodding politely at Liam before continuing his rounds. The man's radio crackled with routine communications about lost children and minor incidents. Liam watched him disappear around the corner toward the boardwalk area, then continued his own aimless wandering. By 4:30 p.m., the crowds had noticeably decreased. Liam found himself near the park's edge, where the carefully maintained attractions gave way to service roads and employee parking areas. The sounds of the park seemed distant here, muffled by a row of tall eucalyptus trees that separated the magical world of Knott's Berry Farm from the ordinary reality of Buena Park beyond. He sat down on a concrete barrier, pulling out his phone to check the time. The screen remained black. He had forgotten he had turned it off. For a moment he considered calling Sarah back, maybe even his father, but the weight of the argument still pressed heavily on his chest, and the familiar urge to disappear, to find somewhere quiet where no one could find him, grew stronger. The last person to see Liam Wilson was a maintenance worker named Carlos Mendez, who was emptying trash cans near the Calico Saloon at approximately 5:15 p.m. Carlos would later tell police that he remembered the heavy-set man in the blue shirt because he seemed sad, walking slowly with his head down, heading toward the less crowded areas of the park. When the park closed at 10 p.m. that night, Liam Wilson was nowhere to be found. Robert Wilson's hands trembled as he dialed his son's number for the 15th time that Sunday morning. The call went straight to voicemail, just like all the others. Liam had missed Sunday dinner with Eleanor and Frank Martinez, something that hadn't happened in over 2 years. The elderly couple sat in their small Anaheim kitchen, Eleanor's famous tamales growing cold on the table, while Frank repeatedly checked the driveway for headlights that never came. "He's never missed dinner without calling," Eleanor whispered to her husband, her weathered hands clutching a rosary. At 74, she had raised Robert after her daughter Maria died in a car accident when he was just 16. Liam was her only grandchild. the light of her remaining years. By Monday morning, Robert had filed a missing person report with the Buena Park Police Department. Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran with graying temples and tired eyes, took the case with the routine efficiency of someone who had seen too many missing adults return home after a weekend bender or an impulsive trip to Las Vegas. "Your son's 28, Mr. Wilson," Detective Morrison explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Adults have the right to disappear. Most of them come back within 72 hours with a story about needing space or working through personal problems." But Robert knew his son. Liam was predictable, almost to a fault. He worked his shift at the electronics store, came home to his small apartment, and spent weekends either with Sarah or visiting his grandparents. He wasn't the type to vanish without explanation, despite what Sarah had told the detective about their argument. The search at Knott's Berry Farm yielded nothing. Security footage showed Liam entering the park at 2:23 p.m. on Saturday, but the cameras in the more remote areas of the park had blind spots. Carlos Mendez, the maintenance worker, provided the last confirmed sighting near the Calico Saloon. After that, Liam Wilson seemed to have simply evaporated. Weeks turned into months. Robert took unpaid leave from his job at the post office to distribute flyers throughout Orange County. Liam's face, round and gentle with kind brown eyes, stared back from telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards. The local news ran the story twice, but it quickly faded beneath more pressing headlines. Sarah visited Robert's house once, 3 months after the disappearance. She sat in his living room surrounded by photos of Liam at various ages and cried until her mascara left dark streaks on her cheeks. "I keep thinking about our last conversation," she sobbed. "I told him he always ran away from problems. What if he really did run away this time? What if he's out there somewhere, thinking I don't want him to come back?" Robert handed her a tissue, his own eyes dry from months of sleepless nights. "Liam loved you, Sarah. Whatever happened, it wasn't because of your argument." Eleanor's health began to decline rapidly. The stress of not knowing consumed her, turning her once bright smile into a permanent expression of worry. Frank tried to maintain his strength for his wife, but Robert could see the old man aging before his eyes. Sunday dinners became somber affairs, with Liam's empty chair serving as a constant reminder of their loss. Detective Morrison worked the case for 6 months before it was transferred to the cold case division. He had interviewed everyone at the theme park, checked hospital records, and even contacted the morgue regularly. Liam's bank account remained untouched, his apartment exactly as he had left it, his car still parked in the lot outside his building. "Sometimes people just disappear," Morrison told Robert during their final official meeting. "I've seen it before. No foul play, no evidence of harm, they just vanish. It's like they step out of their life and into something else entirely." The first anniversary came and went. Robert organized a small memorial service at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, where Eleanor and Frank had been parishioners for 40 years. About 30 people attended, mostly co-workers and neighbors who remembered Liam as a quiet, polite young man who helped elderly customers at the electronics store and never forgot to call his grandparents. By the second anniversary, the missing person posters had faded and been covered by newer announcements. Robert continued his weekly visits to Knott's Berry Farm, walking the same paths his son had taken, hoping for some sign, some clue that everyone else had missed. The security guards knew him by name and allowed him to wander areas normally restricted to guests. Eleanor passed away in her sleep during the winter of 2010, 3 years after Liam's disappearance. Frank followed 6 months later, his heart finally giving out under the weight of accumulated grief. Robert found himself truly alone for the first time in his life, surrounded by photo albums and memories of a family that had slowly dissolved around him. The case file gathered dust in a metal cabinet at the Buena Park Police Department. Detective Morrison had retired, replaced by younger officers who had never heard of Liam Wilson. The theme park had undergone renovations, adding new attractions and removing old ones. The bench where Liam had sat that final Saturday afternoon had been replaced with a modern seating area, but Robert never stopped looking. Every weekend, he drove to different parts of Southern California, visiting homeless shelters, hospitals, and anywhere else a confused or injured man might end up. He kept Liam's cell phone active, paying the monthly bill religiously, just in case his son tried to call home. Years passed like pages turning in a book no one wanted to read. Robert's hair turned completely gray, then white. His own health began to fail, but he refused to give up hope. Somewhere out there he believed his son was still alive, still trying to find his way home. October 15th, 2024. Detective Ray Morrison had been retired for 8 years, but old habits died hard. At 67, he still woke up early, still read the morning paper with his coffee, and still felt the familiar tug of unfinished business when certain cases crossed his mind. The Liam Wilson file had been one of those cases that haunted him, the kind that made him question whether he had missed something crucial. Morrison now lived in a small house in Riverside County, about an hour east of his old beat in Buena Park. The rural area suited his retirement, with its wide-open spaces and slower pace of life. He had taken up photography as a hobby, often driving the back roads looking for interesting subjects to capture with his camera. That Tuesday morning, Morrison was exploring a dirt road near the small farming community of Paris, when he noticed an old scarecrow standing crooked in an abandoned field. The property had clearly been vacant for years, with rusted farm equipment scattered around and a collapsed barn in the distance. The scarecrow itself was a patchwork creation, stuffed with straw and dressed in faded clothing that had been weathered by 17 seasons of sun and rain. Something about the scene appealed to Morrison's artistic eye. He parked his pickup truck and walked closer, adjusting his camera settings for the golden morning light. As he circled the scarecrow, looking for the best angle, his trained investigator's eye noticed something that made him pause. The scarecrow was wearing mismatched shoes. One was a brown work boot, cracked and sun-bleached. The other was a blue and white athletic shoe, a Nike running shoe that looked oddly familiar despite its deteriorated condition. Morrison lowered his camera and stepped closer. The shoe was definitely out of place on a farm scarecrow. It was too modern, too urban for this rural setting. He pulled out his phone and took several close-up photos of the shoe, then carefully examined it without disturbing the scarecrow's position. Inside the shoe, barely visible beneath years of accumulated dirt and debris, Morrison could make out what appeared to be a size marking, 11.5. His pulse quickened as a memory surfaced from deep in his professional past. He had seen that exact shoe before, or at least one very similar to it. Back home, Morrison spent the afternoon digging through boxes of old case files he had kept in his garage. Police departments typically discouraged retired officers from taking files home, but Morrison had always been meticulous about making personal copies of his most troubling unsolved cases. The Liam Wilson file was thicker than he remembered. Photos, witness statements, security footage stills, and detailed reports filled a manila folder that had yellowed with age. Morrison spread everything across his kitchen table and began reviewing the evidence with fresh eyes. There it was, on page 12 of the initial missing person report. Subject last seen wearing blue jeans, blue t-shirt, and blue and white Nike running shoes, size 11.5. The description had been provided by Sarah, Liam's girlfriend, who had helped Robert Wilson compile a detailed list of what his son had been wearing that day. Morrison's hands shook slightly as he compared the photos he had taken that morning with the description in the file. The shoe was definitely a match, down to the distinctive white swoosh logo that was still faintly visible despite years of weather damage. He called the Buena Park Police Department and asked to speak with whoever was currently handling cold cases. After being transferred 3 times, he reached Detective Lisa Chen, a young investigator who had inherited Morrison's old caseload when the department reorganized. Detective Chen, this is Ray Morrison. I'm retired from your department, and I think I may have found evidence related to the Liam Wilson disappearance from 2007. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The Knott's Berry Farm case? That's been cold for over 15 years. I know. I was the original investigating officer. I found what appears to be the victim's shoe in a scarecrow about 60 miles from where he disappeared. I need someone to come out here and process this properly. Detective Chen arrived at Morrison's house 2 hours later, accompanied by a crime scene technician. Morrison led them back to the abandoned farm, where the scarecrow still stood guard over the empty field. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, giving the scene an almost surreal quality. The technician carefully removed the shoe from the scarecrow's foot, documenting its position with photographs before placing it in an evidence bag. The shoe was definitely a size 11, 5 Nike running shoe, blue and white, consistent with the description from the missing person report. How did you know to look here? Detective Chen asked Morrison as they walked back to their vehicles. Morrison shrugged, his weathered face thoughtful. I didn't, I was just taking pictures. Sometimes the universe has a way of revealing its secrets when you're not actively searching for them. That evening, Detective Chen called Robert Wilson. At 71, Robert's voice had grown thin and raspy, but it still carried the same desperate hope it had 17 years earlier. "Mr. Wilson, this is Detective Chen with the Buena Park Police Department. I'm calling about your son Liam's case. We may have found some new evidence." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Robert spoke. "What kind of evidence?" "A shoe, sir. A shoe that matches the description of what your son was wearing when he disappeared. We found it in a Scarecrow on an abandoned farm in Riverside County." Robert Wilson sat down heavily in his living room chair, surrounded by the same photos of Liam that had watched over him for nearly 2 decades. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something that resembled hope. Does this mean you might find him?" Detective Chen chose her words carefully. "It means we're reopening the investigation, Mr. Wilson. We're going to find out how that shoe ended up where it did." The news of the discovered shoe spread through the small circle of people who still remembered Liam Wilson. Detective Chen had contacted everyone from the original case file who was still alive and reachable. Sarah, now 43 and married with 2 children, received the call at her office in Newport Beach, where she worked as a real estate agent. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes after hanging up, staring at her hands as they trembled against the steering wheel. 17 years had passed, but the guilt had never fully faded. She had built a successful life, found love again, raised children, but there had always been a shadow in the corner of her happiness, the memory of harsh words spoken in anger to a man who never came home. Robert Wilson's reaction was different. When Detective Chen called with the update, he listened in complete silence, then asked only one question: "Can I see it?" The next morning, Robert drove to the Buena Park Police Department for the first time in over a decade. The building had been renovated since his last visit, with new security systems and modern furniture, but the institutional smell of coffee and paperwork remained the same. Detective Chen met him in the lobby, a young Asian woman with kind eyes who reminded him somehow of his late wife. "Mr. Wilson, I want you to understand that this is just one piece of evidence. We don't know yet what it means or how it connects to your son's disappearance." Robert nodded, his white hair neatly combed and his best shirt pressed for the occasion. At 71, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his eyes still held the same determined intensity they had carried for 17 years. In the evidence room, Detective Chen showed him the shoe in its clear plastic bag. The blue and white Nike was weathered and faded, but unmistakably the same style Liam had been wearing that October day in 2007. Robert stared at it for a long time, his weathered hands pressed against the viewing window. "That's his shoe," he said quietly. "I bought him those shoes for his birthday that year. He complained they were too expensive, but he wore them everywhere." Detective Chen watched as Robert's composure finally cracked. 17 years of held-back emotion poured out in silent tears that ran down his cheeks and onto his pressed shirt. She handed him a tissue and waited patiently while he composed himself. "What happens now?" Robert asked. "We investigate the property where it was found. We try to determine how long the shoe has been there. Who owns the land? Who might have had access to it? We follow every lead, no matter how small." The abandoned farm in Paris belonged to the estate of Marcus Holloway, a farmer who had died in 2019. His nephew, David Holloway, lived in Phoenix and had been trying to sell the property for years without success. When Detective Chen contacted him, David was cooperative but confused. "I haven't been to that place in probably 5 years," he told her over the phone. "Uncle Marcus stopped farming it around 2010 when his health got bad. After that, it just sat empty. Sometimes transients would camp there, but we never had any serious problems." Detective Chen and a team of investigators spent 3 days processing the abandoned farm. They found evidence of multiple temporary camps over the years: fire rings, discarded clothing, empty food containers. The Scarecrow itself appeared to have been constructed sometime around 2008 or 2009, based on the weathering patterns of the materials used. But it was the discovery of a small metal box buried near the collapsed barn that changed everything. Inside the rusted container, wrapped in deteriorating plastic, they found a wallet, a cell phone, and a handwritten note. The wallet belonged to Liam Wilson. His driver's license photo, taken just months before his disappearance, showed the same round face and gentle eyes that Robert had been searching for across 17 years. The cell phone was the same model Liam had been carrying, though the battery had long since corroded beyond any hope of recovery. The note was written on lined paper in careful block letters. "My name is Liam Wilson. I am hurt and confused. I don't remember how I got here. The man who found me says he will help me get home when I am better. If something happens to me, please tell my father, Robert Wilson, that I tried to come home. I love him, and I'm sorry I worried him." Detective Chen called Robert immediately. When she read him the note over the phone, the silence that followed was so complete she thought the call had been disconnected. "Mr. Wilson? Are you there?" "He tried to come home," Robert whispered. "He tried to come home." The investigation took on new urgency. The man who found me mentioned in the note became the focus of intense scrutiny. Property records showed that several transients and seasonal workers had used the abandoned farm as temporary shelter over the years. Detective Chen began the painstaking process of tracking down anyone who might have been in the area between 2007 and 2010. Sarah drove to Robert's house that evening, the first time she had visited in over 10 years. She found him sitting in his living room, holding the copy of Liam's note that Detective Chen had provided. The house looked exactly as it had 17 years earlier, frozen in time like a museum dedicated to waiting. "I should have been kinder to him," Sarah said, sitting in the same chair she had occupied during those terrible first months after Liam's disappearance. "Our last conversation, I was so angry about such stupid things." Robert looked up from the note, his eyes red but clear. "He forgave you long before you forgave yourself, Sarah. That's who Liam was." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set outside Robert's living room window. For the first time in 17 years, they weren't waiting for Liam to come home. They were mourning him properly, with the knowledge that he had tried to return to them, that his last thoughts had been of love and apology rather than anger or abandonment. The note had given them something precious, the certainty that Liam Wilson had not chosen to disappear. He had been a victim of circumstances beyond his control, and in his final days or weeks, he had thought of home. 3 weeks after the discovery of Liam's note, Detective Chen received a call that would finally close the 17-year-old case. A man named Thomas Garrett, 68, had walked into the Riverside County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with someone about the missing man from the theme park. Garrett was a retired construction worker who had been living in a small trailer park in Paris since 2005. He was thin and weathered, with the careful movements of someone whose body had been worn down by decades of physical labor. When Detective Chen arrived to interview him, Garrett's hands shook as he lit his third cigarette in 20 minutes. "I saw the news story about finding that shoe," Garrett began, his voice rough from years of smoking. "I knew this day would come eventually. I've been carrying this weight for 17 years. Detective Chen activated her recording device and settled in for what she sensed would be a long conversation. Garrett's story began on October 13, 2007. He had been driving home from a construction job in Orange County when he spotted a man walking along a rural road near the abandoned Holloway farm. It was nearly midnight, and the man appeared disoriented and injured. He was stumbling, talking to himself, Garrett recalled. Had a nasty bump on his head, blood in his hair. His clothes were torn up, and he was missing one shoe. I pulled over and asked if he needed help. The man had identified himself as Liam Wilson, but he seemed confused about where he was or how he had gotten there. He remembered being at an amusement park, remembered arguing with someone, but everything after that was fragmented and unclear. "I should have taken him to a hospital right away," Garrett continued, his voice heavy with regret. "But he begged me not to. Said he just needed somewhere quiet to rest, to figure things out. He was scared, kept saying people would be angry with him for disappearing." Garrett had brought Liam back to his trailer, intending to help him contact his family once he recovered. But Liam's condition was worse than either of them realized. He had suffered a severe head injury, likely from a fall or accident in the remote areas around Knott's Berry Farm. His memory came and went in waves, and he often became agitated when pressed for details about his life. "He wrote that note on his second day with me," Garrett explained. "It was during one of his clear moments. He remembered his father's name, remembered being worried about him. But then the confusion would come back, and he'd forget again." For 3 weeks, Garrett cared for Liam in his small trailer. He bought him clothes, fed him, and tried to help him piece together his memories. Liam's physical injuries healed, but his mental state remained fragile and unpredictable. He talked about his father a lot during his good moments, Garrett said. Said Robert was the best man he knew, that he'd been patient with him his whole life. He wanted to call him, but he was afraid. Kept saying he'd caused enough trouble already. On November 3, 2007, Liam Wilson passed away peacefully in his sleep. Garrett found him in the morning lying on the small couch where he had spent his final weeks. There were no signs of distress, no indication of suffering. His heart had simply stopped, likely due to complications from his untreated head injury. "I panicked," Garrett admitted, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I knew I should have gotten him medical help from the beginning. I was afraid I'd be blamed for his passing, afraid I'd go to prison for trying to help." Garrett had buried Liam in a quiet spot on the abandoned Holloway property, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. He had kept Liam's personal belongings, intending to eventually contact his family, but fear and guilt had paralyzed him. Years passed, and the weight of his secret grew heavier. "I made that Scarecrow a few months later," Garrett explained. "Put his shoe on it as a kind of memorial, I guess. Figured someday someone would find it and ask questions. Took 17 years, but here we are." Detective Chen arranged for a search team to locate Liam's burial site based on Garrett's directions. They found the remains exactly where he had described, along with the wooden cross that had weathered but not fallen. The coroner's examination confirmed Garrett's account. Liam Wilson had died from complications related to a traumatic brain injury, with no evidence of foul play. Robert Wilson was 71 years old when Detective Chen called to tell him that his son had been found. He listened to the entire story in silence, occasionally asking for clarification but never interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Can I see where he's buried?" Robert finally asked. 3 days later, Robert Wilson stood in a field in Riverside County, looking down at the spot where his son had rested for 17 years. Detective Chen had arranged for the remains to be released to the family, but Robert had asked to visit the original burial site first. Thomas Garrett was there too, having asked permission to meet the father of the man he had tried to save. The two elderly men stood together in the afternoon sun, separated by decades of grief and guilt, but united by their connection to Liam. "He talked about you every day," Garrett told Robert. "Said you taught him to be kind, to help people when they needed it. He was proud to be your son." Robert Wilson looked at the man who had cared for his child during his final weeks, who had shown him kindness when he was lost and afraid. Instead of anger, Robert felt only gratitude. "Thank you for not letting him die alone," Robert said simply. Liam Wilson was laid to rest beside his grandparents, Eleanor and Frank Martinez, in a small ceremony attended by the few people who had never stopped remembering him. Sarah came with her husband and children, finally able to say goodbye properly. Detective Morrison attended, bringing closure to the case that had haunted his career. Robert Wilson lived for 3 more years after his son's burial, long enough to find peace with the truth. He spent his final months writing letters to Thomas Garrett, who had become an unexpected friend. In his last letter, Robert wrote, "Liam always believed in helping strangers. You proved that kindness still exists in the world, even when everything seems lost." The case of Liam Wilson's disappearance was officially closed on December 15, 2024. In her final report, Detective Chen noted that sometimes the greatest mysteries are solved not by brilliant detective work, but by the simple human need to finally tell the truth. Thomas Garrett never faced charges for his role in the case. The district attorney determined that his actions, while misguided, had been motivated by compassion rather than malice. He continued to live quietly in Paris, tending a small garden behind his trailer and visiting Liam's grave every October 13th. The scarecrow in the abandoned field was removed, but the story of its discovery became part of local folklore. Sometimes, people said, the universe finds a way to bring lost souls home, even if it takes 17 years, and the kindness of strangers to show the way.